to the League of Women Voters Palatine Area Criminal Justice presentation. I am Gail Banakis, and with my co-director, Cami Bassick, and we'd like to welcome you to this evening's meeting. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization of women and men whose purpose is to promote the informed and active participation in citizens' government. As an organization, the League does not support nor do we oppose candidates for public office, but we act only on those issues chosen by the membership for study and action. Our original charter includes Palatine, Rolling Meadows, Inverness, Schaumburg, and Hoffman Estates, but our members reside in towns across the northwestern suburbs. An area of study for us this year is criminal justice reform. Tonight is the 7th in a series of programs on this issue. We invite you to join us again on November 30th for a Let's Talk meeting with our League members. We take study seriously, and we look forward to our consensus on this issue of criminal justice reform that will take place on January 5th and 12th. We in our League are very fortunate, as is the state and the Cook County League, to have working for us Laura Davis and her team, guiding us through this very complex study of criminal justice reform. Laura has been involved in a 3-year examination of the topic, and she is eager to help the rest of us wrestle with these details. It is now my privilege to turn the podium, or in this case, the Zoom meeting, over to Laura Davis, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. Laura.
Well, thank you, Gail. And I am Laura Davis, and I am with the League of Women Voters Palatine Area and have been on the Illinois study team for, actually it's probably going on 4 years now. And I did start with the Cook County League looking at pretrial issues. So we are really delighted, and I have heard Dr. Olson speak before and delighted to have him with us tonight. And I think I first got introduced to his name when we used the Criminal Justice Commission under the Rauner administration, which looked at criminal justice reform. And that final report was published at the end of 2016, and it has been our group's probably primary reference. So a little bit about Dr. Olson. He's professor of criminal justice and criminology department at Loyola University, Chicago. He's also the co-director of Loyola's Interdisciplinary Center for Criminal Justice Research, Policy, and Practice. For nearly 20 years, Dr. Olson worked at the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, where he was the director of Illinois Statewide Drug and Violent Crime Control Strategy Impact Evaluation Program, and was responsible for overseeing the evaluation and monitoring of federally funded drug and violent crime control efforts in the state of Illinois. During his 30+ years in the field of criminal justice, David has worked with a variety of federal, state, and local agencies to develop and evaluate programs and policies, particularly in the area of community and institutional corrections. During his career, he has served as staff to or been appointed to a number of Illinois commissions and task forces established to address crime and incarceration. Dr. Olson currently serves on the advisory boards of the Illinois Department of Corrections, the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, and the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority through separate gubernatorial appointments, and was recently appointed to the Illinois Restore, Reinvest, and Renew Program Board and the Illinois Supreme Court Commission on Pretrial Practices Implementation Task Force. Dr. Olson received his BS in Criminal Justice from Loyola University, Chicago, his MA in Criminal Justice from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and his Ph.D. in Political Science, Public Policy Analysis from the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he was the recipient of the Assistant United States Attorney General's Graduate Research Fellowship. So thank you very much. Just a little background for tonight. I just want everyone to know that I think we're all going to be pretty much on mute. We do ask you to put your questions into the chat box. And I have a couple of people from the study team who are working on Illinois Department of Corrections and post-incarceration recidivism. And I'm going to have them first ask their questions first, and then we'll get to the chat. And we plan probably about 60 minutes for presentation. Sorry, my cat. And about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. And Dr. has also
Somebody's got something going against their microphone.
It might be a cat.
probably my cat.
Oh, yet
So-
another attendee. Do you want everybody to see the chat questions, or just want me to make you co-host, Laura?
Yeah, probably give it to me and we'll try to monitor them so I can combine some if we need to. All right, well,
Oakley dokley.
thank you very much. And I guess we'll get started. Thank you, Dr. Olson.
All right, well, thank you. My mother couldn't have been prouder of that introduction. So, so can everybody see the slide on the screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. That's how I start off every class that I teach, to make sure that everybody can see what I see. So, so I'm going to try to get through kind of a lot of information because I want to make sure that everybody has a good understanding of what is involved with sentencing practices in Illinois and how those impact correctional populations. So kind of what I want to give you is a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to, first of all, caveat this, that everything I'm talking about is really at a state level. I'm kind of giving you the big picture of Illinois. As I was saying earlier, it's important to keep in mind that criminal justice really is a local issue. And it's responded to primarily by local units of government. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to emphasize that while I'm talking about what's going on in the state of Illinois, we have to keep in mind that what goes on in individual counties may look different. And even within individual counties like Cook County, things may look different. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the context of crime, because that's important to understand when we talk about sentencing. I'll also talk a little bit about Illinois sentencing structure. And not to get you too deep into criminal law, but it's important to understand the structure of Illinois' criminal laws so that you can understand where there are opportunities for reform and where there are some limitations that practitioners face with respect to responding to crime. We'll talk a little bit about what the trends are that we see with sentencing patterns in Illinois and how those impact the correctional populations. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some specific areas and opportunities for reform, and hopefully give you some thoughts about how you as a group can try to collaborate and coordinate your efforts with units of local government. All right. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about crime, just so that we all kind of have an understanding of what we mean when we're talking about crime and what crime looks like. Generally, there's a couple different ways that I describe crime. The first is crimes that get reported to the police. So when you find out your car has been vandalized and you call the police come out and investigate it, and they may arrest somebody. That's one way to think about crime, is citizens calling the police when they've been victimized or see illegal activity. The other form of crime is crime that's detected by the police. These are crimes that people generally don't report to the police, but the police observe criminal behavior. It may be illegal drug activity that they observe, driving under the influence of alcohol, illegal possession of guns that they may come across when they make a traffic stop, those kinds of things. It's important to recognize that those are two kind of streams of criminal behavior that the system responds to. One of them can vary dramatically depending on what the police department's priority and focus may be. And I'll show you some examples to illustrate that. The other thing that's important to think about with crime is there's crime that we hear about, and then there's crime that we don't hear about. And when I mean hear about crime, we hear about it through the media. Elected officials may talk about specific crimes when they're running for a campaign or trying to push a specific piece of legislation, and increasingly through social media. we get exposed to crime. The general kind of caveat or rule that I always say is we hear a lot about the crimes that occur extremely rarely. We tend to hear about the most serious crimes, but fortunately those crimes are also the rarest. And so it's important to keep that in mind, and as I present some information, to just ensure that when we think about criminal behavior, that we keep in mind the most horrendous crimes, as serious as they are extremely rare. And we don't want to necessarily make all of our criminal justice policy with the worst crimes in mind when those policies affect the least serious crimes that the system has to respond to. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what does crime look like in Illinois. In Illinois, we have something called the crime index. This is kind of a standard way that we measure crime. There's 8 index crimes. 4 of them are the violent crimes and 4 of them are property crimes. In terms of the violent crimes, the one we're most concerned about is murder. And murder is the rarest crime that occurs. Less than 1% of crime that occurs in Illinois involves a murder. Again, a relatively small percent of crime, but a very serious offense of criminal sexual assault accounts for about 2%. Robbery accounts for 5%. So those 4 crimes of murder, criminal sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault collectively account for a little under 20% of all the crime in Illinois. What accounts for the majority of crime are property offenses that do not involve a direct confrontation between a victim and a perpetrator. So crimes like burglary, theft, motor vehicle theft, and then another rare crime is arson. So when we talk about crime in Illinois, it's important to keep this picture in mind, that the majority of crime in Illinois does not involve violence. But if our perception is that most crimes that occur are the most serious crimes, that's going to shape and influence our perceptions as to what should be done in response to that criminal behavior. The other way to look at crime is to get a sense of what crime has done over time. And so this graph shows you the trends over the last roughly 4 decades with respect to violent crime in Illinois. And the number is plotted against the left-hand axis. You can see here that we saw a dramatic increase in violent crime in the 1980s. It peaked in the early 1990s, and for the most part, it's been going down ever since. Property crime, which we saw from the prior slide, which accounts for a much larger share of crime, and because of the scale, this blue line that illustrates the trend in property crime is graphed along the right-hand axis. So you see the scale is much higher in order to account for the large size. During the 1980s, we saw an increase in property crime, but then similar to violent crime, we saw a drop in property crime. So when someone says crime is up or crime is down, generally what they're describing is the trends in the index crimes. So you see here, during the 1980s into the early 1990s, we saw a dramatic increase in violent crime and an increase in property crime. Now we're seeing a decrease in crime, right? One of the crimes that I want to at least recognize and I don't want to say talk about the obvious concern or issue, that's homicides in Chicago. So if you follow the news locally, watch TV news, read newspapers that are local to Chicago, homicides and shootings in Chicago is usually front page news almost every day. Usually on a Monday, they will summarize how many people were shot and killed over the weekend. So obviously murder is the most serious crime. As I pointed out previously, fortunately, it's also the rarest crime. But you can see here, just to put some things into perspective, really the early 1990s were the highest numbers of homicides that we saw in Chicago. We were close to 1,000 homicides per year. They went down pretty consistently, just like what we saw with all crime. property crime, all violent crime. The increases we've seen in the last few years are patterns that have a lot of people scratching their heads in terms of criminologists. Generally, crime is down, but specifically homicide in Chicago, which tends to be concentrated in very specific neighborhoods, has seen some dramatic increases in recent years. So I just want to recognize that I'm not trying to downplay the seriousness of the homicide problem in Chicago, but again, homicide is the rarest crime, and we don't want to develop every single policy as though every crime involved murder. And that's what we've oftentimes done because that's the only crime that we hear about, and that's what elected officials oftentimes are pressured to do something about, right? Another example of crime, and this is a crime that generally the public does not call the police about. These are crimes that the police detect, usually through patrol or through other investigations, and that's arrests for violations of Illinois' drug laws. So when we look at trends in arrests for drug laws in Illinois, this first line, the green line, is arrests for violations of Illinois' Cannabis Control Act, which is the law that governs or regulates marijuana. You can see here that there was a fairly large increase in arrests for marijuana offenses between 1991 really into the 2010, 2011. And then we saw some dramatic drops. And most of those dramatic drops were the result of changes in the law. So what's not graphed here is what's happened in 2020 since recreational marijuana has been legalized. But prior to that, in 2018, the state decriminalized possession of small amounts of marijuana. And that resulted in many fewer arrests. I don't tend to focus a lot on marijuana as it relates to criminal justice policy and practice because marijuana, even before it was legalized, was classified as a misdemeanor offense, and therefore it really didn't have much of an impact on correctional populations. At the time marijuana was legalized in Illinois, I think there were 40 people in Illinois' prison system that were serving a sentence for a marijuana offense. And those were primarily delivery of large amounts of marijuana. What's more substantial is arrests for violations of Illinois' Controlled Substances and Methamphetamine Control Act. These essentially are the laws that govern the illegal possession and sale and delivery of every other drug, primarily cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. What you can see here is in the late 1980s, there was a dramatic increase in arrests for these offenses. Research has shown that the use of the drug had actually been going down pretty consistently through the 80s and 90s. But what this really reflects is a dramatic change in policing focus and policing emphasis. This is essentially the war on drugs. This was Presidents Reagan and Bush saying that we need to do something about the drug problem, and local communities put pressure on their elected mayors, who then put pressure on their local chiefs of police to, in quote, do something about the drug problem. And at that time, our thinking about the issue was pretty simplistic. There was a thing that the police could do, and that's arrest people and put them through the system. And you see what the effect of that shift in thinking was. This is one where it's, again, important to recognize that Illinois is made up of hundreds of local police departments and sheriff's offices. So in the title, it's got arrests for drug law violations in Illinois times 800 plus. So recognize that this trend you're seeing statewide may look different from community to community in terms of increases and decreases and things like that. Right? The other important thing about the violations of the Controlled Substances and Methamphetamine Control Act is every offense is a felony level offense. So the possession of the smallest amount of cocaine or heroin or methamphetamine is a felony level offense, meaning you can be sentenced to prison if you're convicted of that. Right? Since 2000, we've seen a decrease statewide. Right? So we went from a high of almost 60,000 arrests a year to now we've got about half as many in the state as a whole. Right? So that gives us a little bit of framework to understand the nature of crime that the system is responding to, the trends in crime and arrests the system is responding to. So we'll talk now a little bit about cases moving into the courts and how they get handled. So we're going to look a little bit at trends in felony cases that are filed in court. Recognize that the number of felony cases filed in court is in part driven by crime. So if there's more crime, there will be more arrests and as a result, more referrals to the court. It also has to do with the county state's attorney's office reviewing the charges and deciding whether or not there's sufficient evidence, and also reviewing the charges to determine if that type of crime is a priority for the office. Prosecutors can decline to file charges if they determine that there's not sufficient evidence or they don't think that it's a serious enough offense to warrant a felony case filing. They may just not file charges, or they may file a lesser charge of a misdemeanor offense. We also need to understand Illinois sentencing structure, so what our General Assembly has created for local courts to work within, and then look at the practices that take place. How do local jurisdictions actually execute or carry out those policies through the structure? And then ultimately, the sentencing practices and policies shape the composition and the size of the correctional population. So I'll touch on that as well. So when you look at felony filings in the courts in Illinois, again, in the title, it's got times 102. There's 102 counties in the state, each with their own separately elected state's attorney, which may have different priorities and practices in place. What we can see, consistent with what we saw with violent crime trends, drug arrests, we saw an enormous increase in felony filings in Illinois from the early 1980s to the year 2000. Essentially, the number of felony cases entering the courts in Illinois more than doubled, right? And then in recent years, what we've seen is a fairly substantial decrease in the number of felony filings. Again, explained by the trends in crime that we've seen, but also the trends in arrests for things like felony level drug law violations. Right, so I want to talk a little bit about the sentencing structure in Illinois to help you understand what the courts and prosecutors work within. Generally, Illinois' General Assembly has created the sentencing structure in Illinois as to how crimes get classified. So the General Assembly determines whether a crime will be classified as a felony or a misdemeanor. And then within those broad categories of crimes, the class of the offense. The class of the crime, as designated by the General Assembly, determines what the sentencing options are for a judge. There's certain crimes that by statute are non-probationable. So first-degree murder and crimes that are classified as Class X felonies require a mandatory prison sentence. Increasingly, one of the ways that the General Assembly has responded to a crime that the public is concerned about is they add that crime to the list of non-probationable offenses. So there's a number of crimes that if you are convicted of the offense, it's non-probationable. Things like the possession or sale of a relatively modest amount of drugs. Residential burglary is a mandatory prison sentence, those kinds of offenses. Right. So most crimes that the system processes, felony level offenses, are eligible for probation. Most crimes result in a guilty plea. So very rarely does someone charged with a felony offense have their case resolved through a trial. They're usually plead guilty to the offense, and in return, they're generally given consideration at sentencing for a lesser punishment than they might have faced. More serious crimes tend to be more likely to go to trial. So just as an example, in Cook County, probably 85% of all felonies combined get resolved through a guilty plea. With the most serious crime of murder, only about half of them result in being disposed of through a guilty plea, meaning the other half go to trial, where a jury's impaneled and they present evidence and seek guilt or innocence that way. Right. When it comes to trying to understand who is it that goes to prison and who doesn't of those convicted of a felony, my colleagues and I at Loyola have done a lot of research looking into this across the state. Essentially, the two strongest predictors of whether or not you will be sentenced to prison is what's the felony class of the crime that you were convicted of, and what's your criminal history look like. There's other things that influence it. Things like your age will affect the sentence that you get. Sentencing also varies from county to county. There are some counties that, all things being equal, are more punitive. They use prison as a response to crime more than other jurisdictions. The other thing that we're finding with research is if somebody is detained pre-trial, they are more likely to be sentenced to prison. Again, all things being equal. If they were convicted of similar felony classes with similar criminal histories, if they were detained, they were more likely to go to prison than if they weren't detained. And that really has implications for the bond court reform efforts that are taking place. Right. To give you a little bit of an understanding of the sentencing structure Illinois has created, again, I assume that not everybody here has studied criminal law. So the way that Illinois' sentencing structure is set up is crimes are placed into felony or misdemeanor classes by the General Assembly. So they say, for this crime, we think it's serious enough to say that it should be considered a class 1 felony or a class 3 felony, or maybe this should be considered a misdemeanor offense. I was going to say there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's a lot of rhyme and reason, but there's also some things that many people would question as to whether or not the crimes are classified in a way that most people would agree. The example I usually give to my students is, for the most part, domestic battery is a Class A misdemeanor. You cannot be sentenced to prison if you are convicted of most cases of domestic battery. But if you possess any amount of cocaine, that's a Class 4 felony, and you can be sentenced to prison. Class 1 felonies can include things like residential burglary, right, or motor vehicle theft. So the way the sentencing structure is set up, taking murder as an example, in Illinois, if you're convicted of first-degree murder, generally the sentence that you will receive is somewhere between 20 and 60 years. The judge has discretion as to where within that 20 to 60 years they sentence you. There are certain elements of homicides that increase the punishment that needs to be imposed. For example, if a firearm is used in the commission of a murder, it requires that 25 additional years be added to the sentence. You can also get natural life sentences. So this is the general range of 20 to 60 years. In Illinois, our sentencing structure is such that judges impose a set amount of time, and then the person serves that sentence and is released once the sentence has been completed. Illinois does not have parole. People don't go before the parole board to be considered for release. They're sentenced by the judge to a certain amount of time. They serve that sentence minus some credits they may get for either good behavior or for program participation, and then they're released. Once someone's released from prison in Illinois, they're subject to a period of post-release supervision. In Illinois, we call that mandatory supervised release. So in the case of first-degree murder, if you're convicted of it, you get sentenced somewhere between 20 and 60 years. In Illinois, murder is subject to truth in sentencing, which means you have to serve 100% of the sentence that was imposed by the judge. And once you serve that 100% of the sentence, you're then released from prison and you're subject to 3 years of post-release supervision. At the other end of the felony continuum is a Class 4 felony. If you're convicted of this, you could get a 1 to 3 year prison sentence, followed by 1 year of mandatory supervised release. But a Class 4 felony is also probationable. And so you could be placed on community supervision rather than incarcerated for a period up to 2.5 years. Right? So for most felonies, prison is an option. And in most instances, probation is imposed. Again, murder and Class X felonies, 0% of the people convicted of these crimes are eligible for probation. For a Class 1 felony, which is the next most serious felony, in 2019, almost half of everyone convicted of a Class 1 felony got probation. 58% of Class 2 felons got probation, and on, right? So this illustrates that the less serious the felony class you are convicted of, the more likely you are to get probation or supervision in the community. Combined in 2019, about 2/3 of people convicted of a felony were sentenced to probation in the community. Again, you have to think about this across 102 different counties because there's different sentencing patterns in every county. Some are more punitive, some are less punitive, and so forth. The other thing to recognize is these trends are not constant. So just showing you the difference between 2011 and 2019, you can see some of the effects of the reform efforts and changes in thinking that we've seen by the courts and prosecutors in Illinois. So for Class 1 felonies, which are the most serious felony offense that you could be considered for probation for, we saw that in 2011, fewer than 40% of people who were convicted of Class 1 felonies received a sentence of probation. In 2019, it was almost 50%. And we see that across each felony class. Consistently in the state as a whole, we've seen a larger share of people convicted of a felony being given a sentence of probation in the community. To where now, when we look overall, about 2/3, like I said before, of people convicted of a felony are being sentenced to probation in the community. When we look at the long-term trends in this, we can see kind of a gradual increase in the percent of convicted felons in Illinois getting a prison sentence, kind of reaching its peak in 2009 and 2010, where essentially it was a 50-50 chance. If you were convicted of a felony, half of those individuals were being sentenced to prison, half of them were being sentenced to probation. And so you can see the fairly gradual increase in the use of prison, the fairly gradual decrease in the use of probation until 2010. And then we see that trend reverse. We started to see a lot more attention being paid to the size of Illinois' prison population. And we started to develop a lot of programs and efforts locally to incentivize local jurisdictions to use probation as a sentencing option rather than the costly response of incarceration. So just looking at the trend we saw between the early 80s and 2009, we saw about a 10 percentage point increase in the likelihood that a convicted felon would be sentenced to prison, right? In 2009, that means essentially that there are about 5,800 more people sentenced to prison than would have been sentenced to prison in the 1980s if the rate of incarceration remained constant. What we also have to recognize, though, from the prior slides is the volume of felony cases coming into the court more than doubled during the 1980s and 1990s. So not only did we see an increase in the likelihood that you would be sentenced to prison, but the number of people subject to that increased likelihood more than doubled, right? And as you'll see later, that explains a lot of why we saw the increase in Illinois' prison population. Now, in the last 10 years, we've seen essentially a reversal of that. There's been a 12 percentage point drop in the percent of people being sentenced to prison. Which means in 2019, there were almost 5,600 fewer people sentenced to prison than would have been had the rate of incarceration that we were seeing in 2010 remained. What all this has done, the increases in arrests, the increase in felony filings, the increased number of people in prison, and probation is the number of adults under the supervision of Illinois' justice system for a felony offense increased during the 1980s and 1990s more than 100%. We went from about 60,000 people under the supervision of the justice system in the early to mid 1980s to over 130,000 by 2000. And it remained relatively constant for most of the 2000s. Again, in recent years, what we've seen is a drop in the number of people under correctional supervision. Part of it's the drop in crime, part of it's the reduced reliance on prison as a sentencing response. When we look at those trends for the different groups that make up the correctional population, the first we see the trend with probation. So this is supervision in the community in lieu of a sentence to prison. Next, we see the trend in the number of people in prison. And then lastly is the trend in the number of people under supervision on mandatory supervised release, or in quote, on parole supervision. So in the last 5 years, what we've seen is a 10% drop in the number of people on probation in Illinois, almost a 20% drop in the number of people in prison, and a 14% drop in the number of people on mandatory supervised release, or essentially being supervised in the community under the authority of the Illinois Department of Corrections. To kind of give you the big picture of what does this all mean, at the end of 2019, there were about 113,000 adults in Illinois under supervision of the justice system for a felony. There's a couple ways you could look at this pie chart. One is to recognize that of all the people under the custody of the justice system, 2/3 of them are in the community. 2/3 of them are in the community either on probation or on mandatory supervised release. This is where the structure of the system gets a little bit complicated. In Illinois, probation is a county level function under the judicial branch of government. Parole, or mandatory supervised release, is under the executive branch of the state government. It's a unit within the Illinois Department of Corrections. So one thing to recognize that in places like Cook County or in Palatine or Rolling Meadows or Arlington Heights, you likely have people on probation supervision being monitored by an officer of the court who's a county employee, and perhaps in the same house or the same neighborhood or the same community, you have people on parole being supervised by an officer of the state who works for the Illinois Department of Corrections. Right? So they deal with completely different populations. So one way to look at this pie is 2/3 of the people under the supervision of the system are in the community. The other way to look at it is more than half of them are under the custody or supervision of the state government, of the Illinois Department of Corrections. So if you combine prison and mandatory supervised release, that's a state level function, that's a state level agency. And you can understand how a state level agency may not have a good idea of what people in particular communities prefer in terms of how their policies and practices work, right? So it's one of the challenges of parole when it's a state level function, because the people they're supervising are in communities across the state with very different needs and very different characteristics. The other thing I wanted to give you was kind of a long-term picture of what Illinois' prison population looked like, because I think this is really helpful to understand where we've come from and really how far we have to go in order to get the size of the prison population back to something that resembles what we used to have in the 1980s, right? So if you look at the history of incarceration in Illinois, really from the early 1900s through to the mid 1970s, the number of people in prison in Illinois was pretty stable, right around 10,000. We saw some declines, primarily during periods of war, where a lot of the people that would have been subject to the draft are also the populations that, in quote, are in that high crime age group and gender, right? So males between 18 and 25 have the highest levels of involvement in crime. If they're all off fighting in wars, or many of them are fighting in wars, then they're not here to be incarcerated, right? Starting in the 1970s, though, is when we saw a lot of shifts in sentencing philosophies. Illinois switched from a system where there was parole, where a parole board would make determinations about release, and switched to a system of determinate sentencing where there is no parole board anymore. It was really in response to concerns that parole boards were exercising their discretion in a way that put the public safety at risk. And then during the 1980s and 1990s was when we saw a lot of changes that drove the prison population in Illinois up by almost 100%. Now, in recent years, we've seen some fairly large drops in the prison population. The prison population reached almost 50,000 around 2014, 2015. As of June of this year, the prison population stood at 32,000. So there's been an enormous drop. Some of the drop this year is attributed to COVID because a lot of people who would have been transferred to the adult prison system were being held in local jails because they didn't want to spread the virus. Right. So just to kind of give you a sense of what's gone on to drive Illinois' prison population, one big thing was the war on drugs that we saw. The huge increase in felony arrests led to more and more people being processed through the system and sentenced to prison. We also saw record levels of violent crime in Illinois between 1988 and 1992. There were more violent crimes. As a result, there were more people arrested for violent crimes and sentenced. In response to the violent crimes, we also saw a lot of laws change that made the policies more punitive. One of those was the passage and adoption of truth in sentencing, which dramatically increased how long someone would serve in prison if they were convicted of specific serious violent crimes. The peak in the war on drugs was in the year 2000, which was also around the peak of Illinois' prison population. And then we saw some policies that resulted in the awarding of certain types of sentence credits suspended. So inmates who were in prison as a matter of policy and practice would be awarded 90 to 100 days of sentence credit because of a political issue and political blowback about this policy. It was suspended. And what you can see in the detail of this graph is just the suspension of that sentencing credit resulted in Illinois' prison population going up by about 5,000 in a matter of just a year or two. Right. In 2015, there was I put the little blue ribbon on the slide. There was a commission that was created by former Governor Rauner to come up with policy recommendations that would safely reduce Illinois' prison population by 25% by the year 2025. A number of recommendations from that commission have been implemented. Many more have yet to be implemented. And so there's still a lot of opportunity and room for some of those policies to be supported and advanced to continue to push down Illinois' prison population. Very simply, this may not look simple, but the way that those of us in the field who look at correctional policy think about prison populations is we use something we call prison math. The number of people in prison is a real simple explanation. It's based on how many people are admitted to prison and how long do they stay. So if you want to try to reduce prison populations, you figure out how can we reduce admissions to prison? What policy mechanisms or practices can we implement that reduce admissions? The other thing that we try to do is come up with policies that can reduce the length of stay in prison. If you can reduce court admissions and or reduce lengths of stay, you can reduce prison populations. The other thing that can be considered to reduce prison populations is to try to interrupt what we call the feedback loop that we see in our justice system. So there is a substantial portion of people who are released from prison, who exit prison, that end up as new prison admissions within 3 years. Reducing recidivism, or people coming out of prison continuing their involvement in crime, is another way to try to reduce prison populations. Reducing recidivism is essentially a way to reduce subsequent admissions to prison. So when we look at what caused the increase in Illinois' prison population, about 40% of that increase was driven because we just were putting more cases through the system. More arrests because there was more crime, more arrests because we focused on drug law violations. That accounted for about 40% of the growth. About 15% of the growth is explained by the changes in our sentencing practices that increase the likelihood that you would go to prison if you were convicted of a felony. But almost half of the increase is attributed to longer lengths of stay in prison. And increasingly, judges were either imposing longer sentences or they were required to impose longer sentences, or the Illinois Department of Corrections was required to keep people in prison longer through things like truth in sentencing and the suspension of certain sentence credits. Right? So you can see here that it's a multitude of things that were driving the increase, just like the decreases that we've seen have been driven by a multitude of things. So I want to talk a little bit now about what are some of the things that could be done to further reduce the use of prison, right, which I think is some of the things you're thinking about or wanting more information about. So one set of proposals that's out there that was made by the Governor's Commission in 2016 that a number of legislators currently are trying to advance is to change how some crimes are legally classified from felony level offenses to misdemeanor offenses. A couple examples of those is an effort to reduce the threshold for what constitutes felony retail theft from the current dollar value, which I believe is somewhere around $400, which is a pretty low threshold compared to states comparable to Illinois. In a lot of other states, the thresholds are somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 for a retail theft that would be classified as a felony level offense. There's also some effort to reduce the possession of small amounts of drugs from a felony to a misdemeanor. I'm not sure if anybody saw the ballot initiative in Washington State, where through a ballot initiative, they actually decriminalize the possession of small amounts of drugs beyond just marijuana. Some other efforts are things like making all nonviolent crimes eligible for probation. So currently in Illinois, like I said before, residential burglary is a non-probationable offense. Motor vehicle theft, you have to be sentenced to prison for it. If you sell somewhere between $500 and $1,500 worth of drugs illegally, it's a mandatory prison sentence. So those are some of the proposals. None of these have been codified or adopted in law, but there's some of the proposals that have a lot of support that a number of legislators are trying to move, I think, in this current legislative session. Just to illustrate what can be done with some of these kinds of changes, this shows you the trends in admissions to prison from Cook County for retail theft. So you see in the year 2004, 2005, roughly 1,600 people were sentenced to prison in Cook County for retail theft. In 2010, the law was changed where the felony threshold was raised. I believe it went from something like $100 to the current level of $300 or $400. But you can see what that policy change, how dramatic the drop was in the number of people admitted to prison. In 2018, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office made a policy decision, not a policy decision, but a decision about how they will handle retail theft cases, where they have established internally their own threshold. I believe that if a retail theft does not involve $1,000 or more, they will not file felony charges. They'll still file misdemeanor charges, but they're not going to place a lot of their resources and effort focusing on felony retail theft cases. And you can see the effect of that policy change, where the number of people going to prison dropped from 600 a year to last year, where it was a little over 200. Right? So that's a fairly dramatic drop in the number of people going to prison, really without any change in state law. This is one county though, right? There's 102 counties. Looking at admissions to prison from Cook County for possession of a controlled substance, we see a fairly similar trend. The interesting thing here is this is a change in practices not only by the court and the prosecutors, but also by the police. The police in Cook County, particularly in Chicago, dramatically changed their drug enforcement approaches. And really it was because the communities that they were policing were concerned about how they were being policed. Felony drug arrests in Cook County or in Chicago dropped about 80% in the last 15 years. Almost all that decline is fewer arrests in 3 specific Chicago neighborhoods. So it really illustrates how a change in policing practices in one agency in a few of the communities that they serve can have an enormous impact on admissions to the state prison system. But we also saw changes in the courts. Judges started changing their sentencing practices. We started to develop more and more drug treatment courts. And prosecutors started to change their view and their approach to how they would prosecute drug possession cases. Showing how it can work in the other direction, if we look at admissions to prison from Cook County for illegal possession of a firearm, that is one of the few crimes that we are seeing increases in admissions to prison from Cook County. So again, the important thing is these are people who are arrested for the illegal possession of a gun. These aren't people that have been charged or convicted of using a gun in the commission of a crime. And so around, I think it was 2011, Illinois law was changed to where if you illegally possess a loaded firearm, you are subject to a mandatory prison sentence. If the firearm is loaded and accessible by anybody, you are convicted of what the law describes as aggravated unlawful use of a weapon. Really what it means is you illegally possessed a loaded firearm. What we've seen in Chicago is a dramatic increase in arrests for these offenses. Essentially, they more than doubled over the last few years. And I've seen no evidence to suggest that the behavior has increased. So I haven't seen anything that suggests that twice as many people are illegally carrying firearms. What it really reflects is a shift in policing focus and priority. And as a result, we have more of those cases entering the courts. And because of sentencing policy at the state level, the majority of those individuals are being sentenced to prison. So what we see when we kind of look collectively at what's going on with admissions to prison in Illinois, we see an enormous increase during the 80s and 90s, kind of peaking in 2007 at around 30,000 per year. And since then, we've seen pretty consistent decreases. And again, the slides I just showed you with the drop in retail theft and drug possession cases explains a lot of this. What we've also seen is of those people being sentenced to prison, a larger percent are people who've been convicted and sentenced for a violent crime. So what you can see from this that I think is important is when we sent the largest numbers of people to prison in Illinois in 2005, 2006, less than a quarter of those people had been convicted of a violent crime. In other words, we're using the most expensive resource and response to crime that the system has, primarily to incarcerate people who've been convicted of nonviolent offenses. And really that's what led to a lot of shifts in not only thinking, but efforts to try to incentivize local supervision on probation of people who are charged with nonviolent offenses. What that's done is it's also changed what Illinois' prison population looks like. So the pie on the left shows you what percent of people in prison in 2000 were there for nonviolent crimes. You see that almost half of the people sitting in prison at the end of 2000 were serving a sentence for a nonviolent crime. As of June of this year, only about a quarter of the people that are sitting in prison had been convicted of a nonviolent crime. And just as a caveat, an important qualifier, the Illinois Department of Corrections, for purposes of statistical reporting, considers illegal gun possession as a violent crime. I don't, and we debate over that. We all agree that if you use a gun in the commission of a violent crime, that sure is a violent crime. But illegally possessing a gun in and of itself, I wouldn't buy the argument that that in and of itself constitutes violence. Particularly since Illinois passed a law in, I believe it was 2011, that allows anybody who is not a convicted felon, who's willing to pay a fee and pay for training, to be legally allowed to carry a firearm concealed on their person in the community, right? Many people who carry guns illegally do it for the exact same reasons as people who have concealed carry permits. It's for self-protection because they fear that they will be victimized. And a lot of the populations that are arrested and processed by the system for illegal gun possession live in communities where they have a very reasonable fear, an objective fear of victimization, given the amount of violence in their communities. So a couple more things in terms of strategies to try to reduce the prison population. There have been a number of efforts to try to reduce the length of stay in prison, either by modifying the current existing sentencing structures or increasing the number of programs in prison that inmates can participate in for which they can get extra time off their sentence. And then also efforts are underway and have been talked about for at least a decade to try to modify existing truth in sentencing laws. Just to illustrate an example of that, in Illinois in the 1970s, if you were convicted of first-degree murder, you would serve about 10 years in prison, which is about how long you serve in prison if you're convicted of murder in most developed nations. By the 1990s, if you went to prison for murder, you would serve a little over 20 years. And now if you are sentenced to prison for murder in Illinois, you will serve an average of 45 to 50 years. So you can see how increased lengths of stay, particularly for those crimes, has led to a situation in Illinois where roughly 20% of the prison population is serving a sentence for murder. Most of those individuals will serve between 40 and 50 years, and most will either die in prison or die shortly after they're released, given how long and how old they'll be by the time they are released. The other effort is to try to reduce recidivism, like I pointed out earlier. So just to kind of illustrate what I mean by reducing lengths of stay, one of the things that you can see here is that depending on the felony class of the offense, the General Assembly sets a minimum. So for a Class X felony, the minimum is 6 years. For a Class 2 felony, the minimum is 3 years. One of the things we found when we were doing research for the Governor's Commission is at least 2/3 of sentences imposed to prison tend to be for the absolute minimum amount of time, suggesting that if those minimums were lower, that judges would likely impose a lower sentence, but they're limited, right? If you're convicted of a Class 2 felony, the minimum is 3 years, and what we see is most people get that minimum, right? So one of the proposals that's been offered is make the minimum 1 year for all crimes, with the exception of maybe murder or Class X felony, and give judges more discretion, more latitude. The other thing is the length of time you're on post-release supervision is also articulated in statute. So if you're released from prison after having served a sentence for a Class X felony, you're subject to 3 years of supervision, or 2 years if it's a Class 2 felony, or 1 year if it's a Class 1 felony. Those lengths of time are arbitrary. They're not evidence-based. They were created in 1978 based on our understanding and our views then. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that all those lengths of post-release supervision could be shorter and interfere less with individuals' lives and allow them to kind of get on with their life. All right, the last couple of things I want to mention is recidivism. So people coming out of prison, for the most part, do commit additional crimes. So about 60% of people released from prison in Illinois do get arrested for some other crime within 3 years of their release. To me, that's not a surprise because there are very few rehabilitative programs in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Just as an example, research that we've done shows that only about 15 to 20% of the people that the prison system identifies as in need of drug treatment are actually provided with drug treatment while they're incarcerated. So we shouldn't be surprised at higher recidivism rates because at least historically, there have been not a lot of focus and effort on rehabilitation. That seems to be changing, in part because the population of the facilities is now getting lower and they can start turning their attention a little bit more to that. But the other thing that's important when we look at recidivism is if somebody does get arrested after they're released from prison, in most cases, it's for a nonviolent crime. And so again, if someone on parole commits murder, we're likely going to hear about it on the evening news. That'll likely result in legislative hearings. It may even result in new laws being passed that clamp down on parole and parole populations and things like that. The majority of people released from prison don't get arrested for a violent crime. And if they do get arrested for a violent crime, it's about half and half. It's domestic violence or some other violent crime, right? And I'm not saying domestic violence isn't serious. It's likely a crime that's underreported. But when you think about parolees committing crime, again, what's in our minds oftentimes are the most serious crimes: murder, shootings, rapes, things like that. And again, that's what's driven policy, is that perception that parolees are committing these horrible crimes. Some do, but it tends to be a really small portion. The Illinois Department of Corrections measures recidivism by whether or not someone's returned to prison within 3 years. You can see the graph here. We've actually seen some good improvement. In the year 2000, about 55% of people released from prison were back within 3 years. In 2017, among that release cohort, after they followed them for 3 years, it was down to 40%. Not as low as a lot of people would like, but that's a fairly large drop. And what that means is that's a 10 percentage point drop in the number of people released who are then re-entering prison, right? So that's another explanation as to why we've seen this drop in the prison population. Right, the last couple things that I want to mention in terms of strategies, one is to decrease the overuse of pretrial detention and cash bond. Some people look at this and say, what does this have to do with prison populations? Primarily what it has to do is what I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of research now and research that me and my colleagues have done kind of affirm this, that if you are held pretrial, you tend to be more likely to be sentenced to prison. Not because you're more dangerous than the person who was released, just because that tends to be how the practitioners view that status. The other thing that can be done that has been going on for the last 10 years is increasing the capacity of probation and the competence that practitioners have in probation. One study that we did that I think is interesting and helpful to understand this is we're doing some work in Winnebago County, which is Rockford, where we looked at a group of people who were released from prison and then matched them to a group of people that got probation that looked just like them. In other words, we were able to do an apples to apples comparison. And what we found was the people that they kept in the community on probation had a recidivism rate that was 8 percentage points lower, right? And when it came to violent crime, we saw the same outcome, right? And the way that we've articulated this is if your goal in sentencing is to reduce crime, then keeping someone on probation may actually do more to achieve that. If your goal is punishment and retribution, then I don't think there's a lot of people that would argue that being sentenced to prison is a lot more punitive than probation. It's also a lot more expensive, right? And really the rationale behind this finding is that if you're on probation, you're much more likely to get access to services that address your criminal behavior, right? The last point I'll make, and then I'll stop so that people can ask questions, is one of the recommendations of the Rauner Commission was that jurisdictions should create criminal justice coordinating councils. One of the recommendations of the Supreme Court's task force around pretrial reform was counties should create criminal justice coordinating councils. At Loyola, we've been working with a number of jurisdictions to create these. And I think it's something that I'll offer to you guys to kind of consider. Cook County is very unique in its size and its complexity. The idea of a criminal justice coordinating council for the entire county is me working in the system and with the system kind of boggles my mind. But what you might consider is the league can potentially figure out, how do we do something like that for the communities that we represent, and coordinate with the Cook County Board Commissioners that represent our district. In other words, create a coordinating council that's a little bit more parochial, that's a little bit more focused on the local community and getting to know what the local policies and practices are. So I won't go over these conclusions because I think I've kind of made my point. I'd rather stop there and give people an opportunity to ask some questions. I also have a list of resources. I'll provide the league with a copy of these slides, and then you guys can figure out how you get them out to all your people that were attending. But so you don't need to write all this down. I'll send it out to everybody. All right. So I will stop there. I'll stop sharing so that I can see everybody's smiling faces, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have.
Oh, thank you. That was outstanding and interesting on the coordinating councils, because we are updating our current position for our criminal justice for the league, and coordinating councils is one of those things that's being suggested. And if I remember correctly, I think that the league in McLean County actually is one of the participants in that coordinating council, which I think was one of the first ones that was set up in the state.
Yeah.
Do you, David?
Yeah, that's true. They're one of the first ones. They're probably one of the higher functioning ones, and they've got great representation from the community, right? So yeah. The league, they've got media that participate. When we work with Cook County a lot, we work with a lot of the elected stakeholders. It's difficult to think about what does the community look like in Cook County, because there's so many different communities with very different concerns and issues. And so that's why as I thought about it, I'm like, maybe there should be like regional coordinating councils in Cook County, maybe somehow connected to the courthouses. The area served by the courthouse could kind of be the local catchment area for a coordinating council, just to make it a little bit more localized and have a little bit greater opportunity to participate. Yeah.
So there has been some restorative justice courts set up too, which you're aware of course, down in, is it
Roseland? Yeah, Roseland, I think Englewood maybe.
In Englewood they want to, and another one. So that, as I understand, is more of a kind of a it's more of a individual to the victim and really a community based, which kind of has that little bit of the model, I would say, of a coordinating council in a sense.
Yeah, really the way to think about coordinating councils is think about the utility of me presenting to you what I just did, but it's not the state of Illinois. It's the community that you represent, or it's the part of the county that you have your membership in, right? Part of the idea that we have with coordinating councils is bring people together to talk about what's going on locally, because what's going on locally here is different from what's going on in Chicago. And so if all the policy discussion is driven by what goes on in Chicago, then what about the northwest suburbs? What about the south suburbs? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's really true. So one of the questions that came up was, you talked about the illegal possession of firearms. Mm-hmm. Does that mean no FOID card? What does that actually mean?
It means no FOID card. It could mean that you're under the age of 21, because if you're under the age of 21, you can't legally possess a handgun. It could be that you have a felony conviction, regardless of how old that felony conviction is, right? So, but yeah, in the simplest terms, no, you don't have a firearm owner identification card. And so, if you've got a relative's firearm in your house and you don't have a FOID card and you're the one that has access to that gun, then technically, not technically, you're violating the law, right? Because you possess a firearm and you're not legally licensed to do so. Have it in your car, and now you're really now legally you're in a lot of trouble, right? Because if it's accessible and loaded, then that's a non-probationable offense. That's a mandatory prison sentence.
Wow. So I'm going to reach out to, I think Jackie, that might have some questions to share. You'll have to unmute yourself. You have to.
Working on, okay. Hi, I'm going to follow up just because Laura brought up the subject about, the guns. And I have a question, it pertains to that. So not so long ago, a bill was put into effect to enhance the penalty for crimes committed with a firearm.
Mhm.
And a lot of crimes have firearms that are involved with them. Does research show increasing a penalty for something will change behavior? Will it?
No, no, the research is pretty consistent that longer punishments, more punitive responses do not have the intended deterrent effect. And part of it is with the guns, I'll give you this example. If you have an intention to murder someone and you're illegally carrying a gun with the idea that you're going to do that, you've already essentially determined that you're willing to commit a crime for which you could go to prison for the rest of your life, right? If you commit murder in Illinois with a gun, the minimum sentence is 45 years. And if you're 30, you're going to die in prison, right? So the idea that we can deter your gun use carrying, or your gun carrying through a punitive response. The other way to think about it, and this is what we hear when you look at research that actually talks to people that are engaged in the behavior, they're a lot more fearful of being victimized than they are of being caught by the police. In other words, what the police can do to me if I have a gun is arrest me and send me to prison. What people in my community may do to me if I don't have a gun is they'll attack and kill me, right? So when you think about deterrence, can you really expect deterrence to change behavior when your decision-making process is such that you're in fear for your life, so you're engaging in certain behaviors? What can someone threaten you with that's going to be more severe than that? The other way to think about deterrence is all of us likely hit the brake when we see the police car on the side of the road when we're speeding. And we do that because the certainty of getting caught is almost guaranteed, right? In Chicago, if you commit murder, the odds are better that you will not get caught than you will get caught. So if you commit murder in Chicago, 2/3 of the time, in quotes, you'll get away with it. You won't be arrested. If you shoot someone in a non-fatal shooting, it's less than a 10% chance that you're going to get caught, right? So if we want to tinker around the edges of deterrence, boy, we have a long way to go before we reach a threshold that would actually get someone to think, if I do this, I may get caught, or I'm likely going to get caught. It's a lot more efficient and effective to figure out what can we do to stop the behavior through other means that are less expensive than incarceration, that are more effective, and also recognize that what the focus on illegal gun possession does in terms of a police response. The police are essentially in the community looking for guns. Previously they did it through stop and frisk practices. And then in some jurisdictions, those got ruled unconstitutional. In other jurisdictions, they started to place so many barriers that the police just stopped doing it. Now what they'll do is they'll just pull you over, right? If you don't come to a complete stop at the stop sign, you've violated the traffic law, right? And that gives a police officer the ability to come up to the car and look into it and ask you questions. And then if they have reasonable suspicion, they can initiate a search, right? So the concern is that if we approach it primarily from an enforcement standpoint, we even further alienate the population that's most impacted by this. And then they become less likely to call the police when there's problems and things like that. So it's a frequent question we get. We've done tons of research to show whether or not keeping people in prison longer has any effect. And it doesn't. Other than if you keep someone in prison 20 or 30 years longer, then they just age out, right? But to do that, you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars per person to achieve that. So
I'm curious, if I may, Jackie, I want to get into that a little bit on deterrence or whatever. Felony murder, I mean, that's been in the news a lot. Illinois uses felony murder as charging. And there was one recently where some kids were charged with felony murder when one of their group was shot by a homeowner and died.
Yeah.
So help us to understand what felony murder is and at what age range usually is impacted by that charge.
So felony murder is when you are with someone and you in some way assist them in the commission of a crime, and as a result of that crime, someone is killed. Right? So if your intoxicated boyfriend says, "Hey, drive me to the liquor store, I need some money, I'm going to bring my gun," and you do that, you drive them to it, in essence, you act as an accomplice, and they go into the store and the store owner resists and they get shot and killed. The driver of the car could be charged with felony murder because you engaged in a behavior and supported a behavior that a reasonable person could expect that could be the outcome, right? And the unique case that you're talking about, I think that was up in Antioch, is it wasn't the homeowner who was killed, it was one of the accomplices, right? Yeah. And so I haven't seen a lot of hard numbers on it because in Illinois we actually don't know how many people are serving sentences for felony murder because they're convicted of first-degree murder. That's the sentence. So they're in the Illinois Department of Corrections serving a sentence for first-degree murder. There's not a little parentheses next to it that says felony murder, right? They're just serving a sentence for murder. But it tends to occur with younger people because younger people tend to commit crime in groups. They don't commit crimes individually. So just the nature of criminal behavior by young people increases the likelihood they'll be doing it in groups. I've heard that there's a disproportionate number of women in prison serving sentences for felony murder because they were with a boyfriend who engaged in this. So, so it's an issue. The one thing we don't know, again, because it's kind of the murky area of the courts, we also don't know how many times it could have been charged. And prosecutors exercised their discretion, said, we're not going to charge this girlfriend or boyfriend or this group. And I think that's what ended up happening in Lake County with that case, is I don't think the prosecutor filed felony murder charges on all those youth. If I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. I thought that's how that case ended up being resolved. Is the prosecutor, again, they can look at it and say, in the interest of justice, I don't think it's appropriate in this case. So, yeah. And that may happen a lot. We just don't hear about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm asking Jackie and Maria to contribute questions because they're working on this right now. So Maria, do you have a question you want to ask David?
Well, actually, I want to respond to the case that happened. It was actually in Libertyville, and the state's attorney did charge all the youth of murder for the murder for the killing of their peer. And later, after public pressure, the state's attorney dropped the charges of murder. And I apologize for my dog because he wants to go to the COVID couch. Yeah. Ken, would you take the dog to the COVID couch, please? And so I hope that clarifies that.
Yeah.
I too went to Loyola. I studied criminal justice under Dr. Mundy, many moons ago.
Paul Mundy. So did I. So.
Yeah, there's a lot. So I graduated in January of let's see. I graduated law school 89, so 1985.
Okay, I graduated in 88, so.
Okay.
Close.
So I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain around because you said it. I read it in the documents here. I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain around parole versus mandatory sentencing. Yeah. Right, because since 1978, Illinois got rid of parole.
Correct.
And so really there is no parole. So right. These young men and women, many of them young men and women, really have no hope for rehabilitation because there is no parole. And basically, whatever the sentence is and whatever the mandatory sentencing, here it is, whatever the mandatory sentencing supervised release is what it is.
Yeah.
And now I'm glad that Pritzker and Juliana Stratton are doing something about it. But even there, I'm a little confused because they're saying that in partnership with the General Assembly, the administration has established policies for discretionary parole. Again, the word parole comes up when there is no parole in Illinois. For young adults facing long sentences and increase the amount of incentives available for educational and wellness programming through sentencing credits.
Right.
So credits only come through if there is parole. So help me understand this, because
Okay.
I have to present this to the League of Women Voters,
Okay.
and I have conflicting terminology.
So here's the straight answer. In Illinois, people call it parole because saying mandatory supervised release is too long, right? In Illinois, if you're sentenced to prison as an adult, the sentence imposed by the judge is what you serve, minus any credits you might get for good behavior, but there's also some other credits you can get through program participation. It's called something like earned program sentencing credits, right? And so what it means is if while you're in prison, you participate in those programs, you will get additional time off your sentence, and then you get released from prison earlier than you would if you didn't complete those programs. But it's not a parole board that's sitting there weighing judgment. It's, you know, very formally, it's a contract you sign as an inmate with the warden that says, if for every day that I'm in this program, I get a half a day off my sentence, up to this many days. And if you participate in the program, you get those sentence credits and you're released. The Illinois Prisoner Review Board, the only role that they play in your case is when you're being released, they can set the conditions of your release. So they can say, you need to be on electronic monitoring, you need to go to anger management, you need to go to drug treatment, whatever they may say. But they're not the ones that say whether you get out or not. There are people
But I have to stop you right there. That's not true, because you just told me it's a contract between the warden and the inmate.
Correct.
And the warden is the one who's measuring whether all these agreements according to the contract, or all the clauses according to the contract, have been met.
Mhm.
But you're telling me then it goes up the ladder.
No, it doesn't go up a ladder. If you do that, if I'm sitting in a prison and I sign a contract that says, if I stay in this program for 90 days, I get 45 days off my sentence. After the 90 days, if I've stayed in the program, I get the 45 days off my sentence. And then I get released 45 days earlier, right? The issue, so the issue with parole, because people want to bring parole back, right? Because they feel that people who've rehabilitated themselves and shown the error of their ways should get out earlier, right? If I got sentenced to prison for 50 years and after 30 years, I was a model inmate and I did everything I could to better myself, even though I'm subject to truth in sentencing and still have another 20 years to go, there should be a mechanism to get me out, right? And that's why people want to bring back parole, so that there can be a body that would say, you know, this person's really done well, they deserve to be released early. In the 1970s, one of the reasons why Illinois got rid of parole was essentially the way you earned your way out of prison was by completing programs. But there were no programs in the prisons. And so, more liberal people said the prison system's screwing everyone over, right? They're saying you can get out early if you complete a program, but we don't have any programs. So we're just going to keep you in prison for your entire sentence. And there were more conservative people that didn't like parole because why did the parole board let this person out who then committed a crime? They must be a bunch of idiots. We shouldn't give them any discretion. So parole was abandoned to where the law now says you get your sentence, you serve it, minus any good conduct credits you get, and then you're out. And there is no parole board that says we don't think you've rehabilitated yourself enough, or you still pose a danger to society. The last thing I'll say that really complicates it is there are still people in Illinois' prisons that are serving sentences under the old law. So there's people in prison that have been in prison since before 1978 that still do go before the parole board, who considers whether or not they should be released. Because they essentially were sentenced under the old laws, and they decided at that time that they'd rather keep that sentence. And there are people that have committed really serious high-profile crimes, and most of them never get out because the parole board's not willing to let them out. So, but that's a small number.
Well, thank you. In the interest of time, because we're already hitting 8:30 here, I think, Jack, you had one more question, and then if anyone else still wants to stay on, and I don't know how your time is doing, David.
I'm fine. I'm fine.
Okay.
You know, I put questions in the chat room, so if you could address those at some point.
All right, let's see what we got. Jackie, go ahead. You had something?
Well, I'm just curious because I know that the commission that David was on in 2016, their goal was to reduce the prison population by 25% by 2025. And his chart showed they're on the right course to do that. It's a reduction of 21%, I believe is what I saw. And that's terrific. My question is, though, from what I understand, the cost of the criminal justice system in Illinois is quite large. And I tried to look this up in the Illinois budget, state budget, and there isn't any specific line items for the Illinois Department of Corrections, but I'm wondering, I'm just curious, do you know what percentage of our state budget is allotted to our criminal justice system or to the Illinois Department of Corrections alone?
Yeah, I know the Illinois Department of Corrections budget, I think, is around 1.6 or 1.7 billion dollars.
Okay.
You won't find the cost of the criminal justice system in the Illinois state budget because the majority of it is borne by municipal and county government. So keep that in mind. The cost of the system to the state government is really limited primarily just to the Illinois Department of Corrections, and then I won't call them small functions, but things like judicial salaries and a portion of probation officer salaries. But the biggest areas we spend money on is prisons and policing. So I think the Chicago Police Department budget, for example, is right around what the Illinois Department of Corrections budget is. I think it's around $1.7 billion. Those are just two agencies out of the 1,000 that are in the state, or thousands in the state.
So it's in our public interest to reduce the number of incarcerated and people in our criminal justice system.
If it means less money is being spent. So that's one of the areas that I am a little bit critical on. Is there's a lot of policy proposals and the argument is it'll save us money. And I'm increasingly saying you can't use that line anymore because it's not true. Illinois' prison population is down. The 20% I showed you on the graph was because I didn't want to pad it with the effect of COVID, because it's down more. It's probably beyond 25% drop. Their budget's gone up. So as the prison population's gone down 25%, I think their budget has increased around 20%. So less crime, fewer cases, fewer people under supervision has not translated into cost savings like most people have promised. The current budget cliff we're facing may force that, right? There's a dynamic with prisons that you need to understand, that prisons provide a local economy in communities that don't have a lot of other options given the changing nature of agriculture. So I have a slide that I show in some presentations where Governor Quinn, when there was efforts to close the Pontiac Correctional Center, which is one of the state's oldest prisons. It was built in 1870. They were going to close that and move all the inmates to a brand new prison that was built on the Mississippi River. And in his press release, he said, now's not the time to be putting people out of work and decimating the local economy where this prison's at. And so his justification for keeping the prison open had nothing to do with public safety. It was all about the jobs that it provides to local communities. So there's a lot of resistance that's faced by state legislators who try to close prisons and cut prison budgets because of the constituency.
Yeah, I know that's a big deal. So I know Sandra had a couple of questions in here. She was asking about, well, the data from the coordinating council pilot counties, and you already mentioned that McLean County had shown really good results. And then continuing on, she was curious about, if I can find it here, how effective a deterrent is community development or jobs in terms of preventing.
Yeah, that's not a deterrent. That's just it's a more efficient, longer term response to crime, right? The issue that I see is a lot of people look to the criminal justice system as the solution to crime, and that's not where the solution lies. Criminal justice system is set up to respond to crime. So once a person has reached the point where they're engaged in criminal behavior, then the justice system gets involved and they start providing services and resources. It's a lot better to do that earlier on, right? So if you look at early childhood development, prenatal care, early access to medical care, all those things have much better and much clearer impacts on criminal behavior than tougher penalties or longer prison sentences or more police on the street. So it really is that. How do you develop communities, healthy communities with resources and services and places where youth don't feel like they need to carry guns to stay safe because everybody's either in school or working or in environments where there's not trauma. So those are, I think that's what most people recognize. The challenge as for that being a response is that takes a long time to do. And most voters aren't patient enough, right? If crime's up, they want something done today to fix it. And our response generally has been, well, we can pass laws really quick that get tougher, or we can hire more cops, or we can, build more prisons. But the things that take decades to do are the things we don't have a lot of patience for. But there's some interesting efforts. The R3 program board that I'm on is the one that's taking 25% of the marijuana tax revenue. All that money is designated to go into grants to communities that have been most impacted by incarceration and poverty and gun violence. Where I live in Arlington Heights, no one here can apply for that money because we're not on the community list. So it really is an effort to say, let's take money and focus it on the communities that need it most, and not use it to just pay for more police and more probation officers. It's for economic development. It's for services, things that actually benefit the community. So that will be very interesting because the amount of money being generated from the marijuana tax revenue is substantial. And that may actually be able to generate the kinds of grassroots community level improvements that can be sustained, because I don't think they're going to make it illegal again. And that stream of money is just going to be kind of flowing from now until whenever. So it might be the one opportunity where there is a steady stream of resources that can support the development in the communities that need it most. So.
Yeah. So if I can, I apologize to everyone. We do have quite a few questions, and I know I had another list of 3 different sheets. However, just 2 more if I can bring in. Racial makeup of prison population, and is there any impact or emphasis on bias training? Does it make a difference?
So the prison population very much reflects the characteristics of people who get arrested and processed by the system. So a lot of people ask, is the criminal justice system biased against minorities? The way I describe it is where we tend to put our resources and focus tend to be in the communities that are primarily made up of people of color. The police go there and they enforce the law and they arrest people. Some things like the war on drugs had a disproportionate impact on minorities. I think implicit bias training can be beneficial. I think there have been some efforts at requiring it as part of police training, or not just police, because it's really something that the entire system could benefit from. But you know, I try to give my students kind of an exercise to think about that. If you're the superintendent of the Chicago Police, where would you put your police resources? What communities would you put a large number of your officers? And most people say where the crime is, right? Where the crime is are those same communities that don't have economic opportunity and have high rates of poverty and drug use and all that. Well, we put our police there. The police observe criminal behavior and they make arrests, right? One way you could undo that is say, you know, we're not going to put police in those communities. We're going to put them all in Lincoln Park. There'd probably be some pushback, right? So part of it is, I mean, the way people frame it is, if you're going to put police in our community, don't bring them as an occupying force. Bring them there to help us solve problems. And that's where the ideas of police community relations comes into play. But the racial disparity in the system is one that's recognized by a lot of people. Some of it's structural in how we have our laws set up. One example I give to, again, students is if you drive under the influence of alcohol, that's a misdemeanor until you're convicted a third time, and then it becomes a felony. Most people who are arrested and engage in driving under the influence of alcohol look very much like me. White, middle class, employed, live in the suburbs. So my criminal behavior, if I were to engage in that, would be pretty minor legally. It's a misdemeanor until I get convicted 3 times. If I possess cocaine, that's a felony. If I sell cocaine, if it's a few grams of it, it's a mandatory prison sentence. And so some of it's that structural stuff with how we set up our laws. If we enforce tax evasion laws like we did drug dealing, the prison population would look very different, right? So some of it's how we've got our systems structured, what crimes are a priority for incarceration, but also where we have policing resources and what we tell those police to do.
Well, I totally agree. Thank you so much, Dr. Olson. I do apologize there. We had a great engagement tonight. I really appreciate it. Wonderful presentation. We might be reaching out to you through email.
Sure, do that.
A few questions. And it looks like we could be doing some things better, and that maybe a lot of our laws are more emotion driven than evidence-based driven.
Yeah. And the one thing in the conclusion that I just want to make the point of is all those changes you've seen in sentencing and the prison population, almost none of those are due to changes in law. It's due to changes in practices by local elected officials. A lot of people are concerned because if we don't codify things, then, as you said, if something happens and all of a sudden the public says, do something quick, if we still have the old laws in place that allow you to send more people to prison, that's what many people fear will be the response. So the important thing is to codify and change the laws that most practitioners now have adopted as practice. So.
I agree. I think in Illinois, the Black Caucus is kind of pushing forward with hopefully some sentencing ideas. So anyway, again, I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Dr. Olson. It was fabulous. And thank everyone for participating. I want to let you know, thanks, Sandra. We're going to be having a couple more talks coming up. Let's Talk, our league ones are going to be on Monday, November 30th at 7 p.m. We're going to do sentencing, funding, criminal justice coordinating councils. And then on Tuesday, December 8th, we're going to do another Let's Talk on the Illinois Department of Corrections, post-incarceration and sentence completion, from recidivism to successful reentry, and courtroom procedures and access. So you can check out our website, League of Women Voters, palatinearea.org. And thank you and good luck, good night, and thanks for my tech support and everything. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I appreciate the opportunity, and email away. Just make sure you get the right email address and don't send it to D. Olson without the 1 at the end. But I'll send out my PowerPoint and you guys can forward it to everybody and feel free to include my email there as well. So,
Okay, that would be good. Send it out then that way.
Right.
Perfect. Okay. Well, good night, everybody.
all right, bye.